wasn't going to watch this movie, because while I do hate myself, that hatred hasn't quite grown into masochism yet. I also didn't want to give Netflix the assurance that making content like this is the right thing to do. But curiosity got the better of me, and I can't say I've seen every Jane Austen adaptation in existence if I haven't. So let's talk about Persuasion.
Now we're worse than exes. 'Cause he's a 10. I never trust a 10.
Playlist he made me.
And how would you dance to Beethoven?
Alone in my room with a bottle of red. We're friends.
Persuasion 2022, Derogatory, is an adaptation of Jane Austen's 1818 novel Persuasion. It follows Anne Elliot, a 27-year-old woman on the edge of spinsterhood who is deeply practical and morose and is hiding heartbreak from something that happened nearly a decade earlier. She had been in love with Frederick Wentworth, but her family persuaded her from marrying him due to his poor connections, and she has lived with this regret for the rest of her life, never marrying even as every other person her age settled down. And then Wentworth shows up again, a captain naval officer now, with his own self-made fortune, and drastically raised up in society from 8 years previously. The novel follows them as Anne is forced to spend time with him and reconcile that her feelings for him are just as strong now as they were almost a decade ago. Perhaps stronger. And that he doesn't feel the same, has every right to hate her for what she did, and resigns herself to spinsterhood in the face of his almost certain rejection. It is a deeply heartbreaking novel, the last one Jane wrote and published posthumously after her death in 1817. Anne Elliot is a practical, patient, deeply feeling woman who hides all her emotions below the surface in order to function in a society that does not allow those feelings. She is out of step with the people who surround her, who are all rambunctious or driven, and often joke around in a way she cannot, often at her expense, often cruelly. In this way, she and Wentworth are the same, both much more introverted and introspective than the other people in their lives, looked down on for all the wrong reasons, and it is this that makes them such a good match. Their goals, their temperaments, and their feelings all align to create one of the most beautiful romances ever written. You might not have seen every Jane Austen adaptation like some people, but most people have at least heard the most famous line from this novel. "You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope." I think people take this line out of context far too much. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a raw as hell line, regardless of context, but it's the context of the entire novel leading up to this confession that makes this line hit so fucking hard. Like, we don't know what Wentworth is thinking. The story is about Anne, and she's convinced she's lost her chance with him forever, and half the novel is her grieving that while he sits not 2 feet away from her. And then he leaves her the letter, and details all the regrets and worries and fears that he has, while admitting that he never stopped loving her. She pierces his soul, and he is half in agony at her closeness, at her possible rejection, at how much he loves her, and half in hope that she might feel the same. Reading that for the first time absolutely floored me. I'm not an overly romantic person in my real life. I think grand romantic gestures are stupid, and there are very few over-the-top rom-com love declarations that I would truly say are actually romantic to me. And yet somehow 3 of Jane Austen's novel confessions have ended up in my top 10 most romantic lines of all time. Hell, one of them is my number 1, but we're not here to talk about Emma. If you want me to, I could do a video on that, but I digress. Part of what makes Jane Austen's lines hit so hard, even now over 200 years later, is that she fundamentally understands people. Anne Elliot perhaps most of all, written when Jane too was a spinster, dying of an unknown illness and thinking back over her tragically too short life. Anne Elliot is a character built on Jane's regrets, but also on her love of writing and people and love. She's a love letter to the quiet women who feel deeply in a world that doesn't care about those feelings. Jane's characters stand the test of time because she wrote women that asked to be understood rather than be expected to change. Revolutionary for the 1800s. And honestly, even now some writers don't clear that bar. Darcy falls in love with Elizabeth because she's so unlike what he thought he wanted. She's so unwilling to do anything that will not make her happy, and he adores her for that, even as he's wrestling with his own preconceived notions of what a marriage should be. Elizabeth didn't want to be changed by a man. She wanted to be seen for who she was, obstinate, headstrong girl, and loved for that. Emma Woodhouse is stuck up and talkative and thinks she knows better than most people in her life, but when she makes mistakes, she can admit to it. She feels bad. She only ever wants to do the right thing, even if she frequently goes about it the wrong way. And George Knightley has been in love with her for years. Keeps it to himself, even as she appears to be courted by someone else, and only shows the emotions when that man reveals himself to be engaged. Even then, only angry on her behalf, sparing barely a thought for his own feelings until she opens the door first. Emma isn't the kind of person that everybody likes. She's notably one of Jane Austen's most divisive protagonists. But George Knightley likes her. He likes scolding her when she's overstepping, likes the way she oversteps anyway and then learns from it. He likes her pettiness. And Emma is never asked to change by him. She only changes by virtue of her own self-growth. Jane Austen is one of the earliest truly feminist writers, groundbreaking in her own way, even if she died before she could see the impact it would have. And Persuasion is a brilliant example of this, of expectations placed on women to behave a certain way, to put their own wants aside for the sake of their family and society, of the toll that can take on a person until they believe they're not worthy of being loved for who they are, who compromised so much they barely recognize themselves. So why does this adaptation in the year of our Lord 2022 feel so sexist? Remember all those rom-coms from the 90s and early 2000s where there's like an uptight woman who meets a chill guy and eventually realizes she needs to be chill too, or gets broken up with and then loses her sense of self, gets drunk and starts acting ridiculous, or I don't know, generally has very little agency and plot outside of her romantic plotline, even though she's literally the main character, or at least one of them? You know what I'm talking about. They usually starred Katherine Heigl, Jennifer Aniston, or Sandra Bullock. No hate to those actresses, by the way, they all did a great job with what they were given. And actually, as an aside, can we talk about Dakota Johnson for a second? Is there some kind of personal vendetta against Dakota Johnson in Hollywood, or is she just genuinely bad at picking roles for herself? Because she, or somebody around her, seems to be intent on making me dislike her as much as possible. And that's ridiculous, because I do like Dakota Johnson. She's got great comedic timing, she can hit an emotional beat well, and she's overall a pretty good actress. And she seems great in person. Plus she exposed Ellen, so that's double points.
How was the party? I wasn't invited.
Actually, no, that's not the truth, Ellen. You were invited.
Yet for some reason, she keeps taking these roles that I have no choice but to despise, and I feel bad about it. She, much like Catherine, Jennifer, Sandra, Kate Hudson, Julia Roberts, Rachel Lee Cook, Anne Hathaway, and any other woman who has played these type A women who need to change in order to find love, are not the problem. The people writing the scripts where this is the plot are the problem. It's not a new idea to point out that so many rom-coms feature men who are less than perfect but are never expected to change, or if they do, there's something superficial that can tie up the plot in a bow. Adam Sandler movies are the obvious punching bag, but these kinds of movies were a dime a dozen for 20 years. Sexism is a thing. Surprise! In the last decade or so, however, we as a society have been getting better about the way women are depicted on screen. That's not to say there weren't great female characters mixed in with those bad ones. There absolutely were. Some of them even played by those actresses I mentioned earlier. But there was definitely a societal shift sometime in the 2010s towards depicting more well-rounded female characters, particularly in rom-coms. So why does Persuasion feel like a step back? Partly, probably, because the Anne Elliot in this adaptation is simply not Anne Elliot. I couldn't think of two more disparate characters if I tried. It's like if you replaced Jane Bennett with Lydia Bennett and then didn't see any problem whatsoever with that decision. In fact, it's almost exactly like that, because as she's written, Jane Bennett and Anne Elliot are probably the most similar of Jane's characters, at least in their outward temperament. They're subdued, polite, and although Jane has more good humour than Anne, Anne isn't without humour entirely. She can hold her own in a conversation while maintaining an air of propriety and keeping her comments subtle. She isn't as shy as people like to pretend she is. She's not as shy as Jane, but she's subdued, sidelined. Anne Elliot 2022, derogatory, is what you get if you watch Fleabag while high, completely miss the point, shake Persuasion so hard that a few pages fall out, and then write a script based on those pages. While still high. She's catty, she's bitter, she blames other people for her predicament, which is something novel Anne would never do, because even though her unhappiness is her family's fault, she blames herself first for not being strong enough in her convictions to stand up for them and reach for what she wants. Overall, this version of the character is just not a whole person. She's a caricature of a bitter ex, one which I thought we were moving away from as a society, which is only made all the more offensive when considering that she's overlaid onto one of the most subdued and complicated female heroines in romance history. I cannot express how furious this makes me. Until I saw this film, my least favourite Jane Austen adaptation was 2005's Pride and Prejudice. And I know that's a controversial opinion because people adore that movie. And I'm not even necessarily like a purist when it comes to adaptation. In fact, I think a lot of adaptations are really well served when they stray further from the source material. I even have a video coming up about my opinions on good and bad adaptations, and I think change can be really good. But what I find infuriating is when they deviate from the core of the story. And that is why I hate that movie. One tiny decision in one scene of that movie changed the core of Darcy's character. Sure, something romantic love confessions in the rain, something. But the order in which we put words matters. That sounds obvious, but apparently not to whoever wrote this script. Disregarding the tacked-on end scene for the Americans that made me throw up in my mouth and then struggle not to throw my TV out of the window, Let's just talk about this scene for a moment. The first proposal.
I fought against my better judgment, my family's expectation, the inferiority of your birth, my rank and circumstance, all these things, and I'm willing to put them aside and ask you to end my agony.
I don't understand.
I love you. Most ardently.
Why would you take one of the most romantic scenes in history and make it worse on purpose? I can recite Darcy's entire first proposal from memory. It's one of my top 10 love confessions, after all. It's got everything.
This place has everything. Glass, steam, bear traps.
It's a backhanded proposal because it starts with an internal struggle and then a confession, and it's only after Elizabeth expresses shock that he starts listing off reasons that he shouldn't like her, which makes everything worse. Keeps putting his foot in his fucking mouth. They're in a drawing room. It's awkward. It's just the two of them, which is already uncomfortable because men and women didn't tend to be alone in rooms together back then. It was not the done thing. Long silences, charged air, upper-class propriety getting in the way, which is a theme of like all of Jane's novels. And the stupid fucking 2005 movie made him propose in the rain, did it out of order, and changed the best line in the book. Fuck this whole scene. Fuck it to hell. It has him front load the proposal with all of the reasons she's unsuitable, basically rendering it as the 1800s equivalent of negging. It's all about him, about his struggles, which the book proposal is too, but nowhere near as much. Not in a way that puts it all on Elizabeth to fix. Book Darcy says, my feelings will not be repressed. And the only thing he says Elizabeth must do is listen to his confession. And even then, the word must is contextual and doesn't actually mean must, has to. 2005 film Darcy puts it all on Elizabeth to end his agony. And then he says, I love you, most ardently, like some limp dick dandy boy, because the screenwriters would have no idea what the fuck good writing and romance was if it came over with a stick and beat them to death. I mean, I have other problems with the film, but that's the main one. As a writer and screenwriter myself, this scene causes me physical pain. In the name of being fair and balanced, here are the things I think the film did right. The cinematography was lit, Matthew McFadden did a good job with what he was given, and also his voice is nice to listen to.
May I see you back to the village?
No. I'm very fond of walking.
Yes. Yes, I know.
That one hand shot. Now that is some fucking yearning. If the whole film had been made with that subtlety, it might actually have been a good adaptation. But nope, only those 10 seconds. And I've seen modern adaptations, gay adaptations, Lost in Austen, and all of those changed things, but none of them changed an iconic line so fundamentally that it undermines the character of one of the best leads in romantic history. It changed the core of who he was, and it ruined the rest of the experience watching the movie for me. I never recovered from that moment. Anyway, my point is that dialogue makes a difference in how your characters are perceived. And if you're not careful, you can fundamentally change something in adaptation that could ruin the core of the story, no matter how subtly. And is persuasion subtle? Fuck no! I once said that if Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet paints with the brush of subtlety, then Mel Gibson's Hamlet takes that brush and beats you over the head with it. I now have to retroactively apologise to 2005's Pride and Prejudice for thinking of it as the Mel Gibson to the 1995 version's Hamlet. Because this is the Mel Gibson to Jane Austen herself. This is offensively bad. And it wouldn't have been anywhere near so upsetting had it not been a Jane Austen adaptation. Regency era is in at the moment, and I'm sure it would have done fine if it was just released as a modernish Regency romance. Fleabag meets Bridgerton sort of shit. But no, they had to use the framework of one of the most understated and beautiful romances of all time to make their schlocky, frustrating, over-the-top rom-com that I can't even compliment by seeing it as camp, because it's not even camp. If it's going to be bad, the least you could do is make it campy. Whoa. Take a breath, Tallis. I like Bridgerton, but I think it's set a dangerous precedent. With how it's blended modern and Regency aesthetics and temperaments and dialogue, it's brought Regency romances back into the mainstream, which, to me at least, can only be a good thing. Especially when we're casting more people of colour in them. As an aside, Henry Golding should have been the main lead of this movie. That man can have chemistry with anybody, and also Wentworth is quiet, but he's not boring, and I don't know why they made him boring in this movie. Henry could have given him a bit of a spark, even with the bad script they had, because he has enough charisma to carry it off. Or maybe not. Maybe it would be impossible to make this version of Wentworth endearing. It's impossible to know at this point. I will say that overall, I think the cast were doing a really good job with what they had been given, and what I wish they had been given was a better script. As an aside, the 2020 Emma was, like, fine, but I feel like a lot of the Austen adaptations, like, hinge on having, like, a really well-depicted male lead, which is why 2005's Pride and Prejudice gets a tiny bit of a pass on Matthew McFadden's performance of Darcy, because I think he does embody that whole, like, shy, stumbling over himself, putting his foot in his mouth, fucking idiot thing, rather than necessarily being too arrogant. I think he did a good job with that, but I think I've struggled with Emma and with this in that, like, their main leads are really dull, or, like, not, I don't know, I don't know if they're not picking the right cast, or if the cast are just not getting good enough script, or the direction's bad, but, like, George Knightley is one of my favourite romantic protagonists. He has my favourite love confession ever, and I don't know, it wasn't good, or as good as I wanted it to be, I guess. I think we need to be figuring out, like, what, because Jane Austen's one of the best writers of men out there. She writes men who women fall in love with. We're still falling in love with them 200 years later. It's crazy to me that we can't be casting men that embody those characters better. Anyway, that's like a short aside, but, like, I fully digress. Back to the script. And speaking of scripts, there was an attempt a few years ago to make a darker Pride and Prejudice reboot, which is just so the opposite of everything anybody could possibly want in a Pride and Prejudice adaptation. And also, Death Comes to Pemberley exists, which has a literal murder in it. So if you want your dark, broody themes, you can just watch that. People don't want a darker Pride and Prejudice. We don't need grittier and more realistic reboots of stories that have stood the test of time precisely because they aren't that. Not every story needs to explore the desolation of man. But now that we're not trying to make gritty reboots out of everything, we seem to be doing the opposite. We can blame a lot of things for this. Deadpool, Guardians of the Galaxy, Fleabag.
Haven't seen her since. Except for... Nice jumpsuit.
Thank you. You look well. Where have you been?
Boots. It's lovely there this time of year.
Good movies and TV shows that set a precedent to clueless execs that adding witty banter and tonal inconsistencies into a script works with audiences, while failing to realise that it only works when those scripts are well written and executed. Deadpool was a passion project. Fleabag was based on a play that the star wrote herself. Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok were breaking out of the mould of previous Marvel movies, and then accidentally made that the mould of all future Marvel movies. Trying to recreate someone else's success is already an uphill battle because audiences can tell when something is soulless. But attempting to do it with source material that was already successful for being exactly in opposition to that style is, frankly, deranged. Not to mention, Mansfield Park already did this fourth wall breaking protagonist shit in 1999 and to better results!
And Mrs. Norris's husband died, which did not seem to inconvenience her very much at all.
Persuasion is already a hard novel to adapt. There are 2 adaptations, or I think there's 3, but 2 main ones, both of which I like but have problems with. The main issue is they tend to stray too melancholy, which can make Anne seem a little bland, which she absolutely isn't. The solution for this isn't to make her a wisecracking caricature, especially when multiple other Jane Austen novels would have better suited this tone. Emma, obviously, would be a fabulous choice for a fourth wall-breaking protagonist, given how opinionated she is, and how silly she believes a lot of the people around her to be. Catherine from Northanger Abbey would be way better suited to this wisecracking, silly tone because she's young and imaginative and silly. Persuasion is not that kind of story. It is a quiet, ruminative tale of yearning. And as a touch-starved gay, that speaks to me on a spiritual level. The people around them, for the most part, don't even know they used to be together because they're both trying to keep their feelings hidden. Yet, in the 2022 movie, it is commented on by multiple characters in scenes made overbearingly obvious to even the most disinterested of viewers. Nothing was allowed to be subtext in this film. Nothing. There are countless grating modern references in this film, like Anne's sister calling herself an empath, a stack of sheet music being referred to as a playlist, and the phrase, "He's a 10, I never trust a 10, which I could have given a pass were they successful, but with the exception of maybe the empath line because it suits that character, they were all unfunny and uninteresting and bad. The worst one for me personally was her describing dancing to Beethoven alone in her room with a bottle of red. Disregarding the phrase, bottle of red, how are you dancing to that music, Anne? With what implements for listening to music are you dancing to, Anne? Do you have an entire band to play for you while you are alone in your room, Anne? I think what pisses me off the most about all of this is that the same excuses get trotted out every single time without fail. The novel is too period. The language isn't approachable. It needs to be updated or nobody would watch it. Failing to note that there are plenty of versions of classic novels, and even Jane Austen alone, where they barely changed the language at all. The 1995 version, for example, which was, and remains, wildly beloved. And also, if they want a modern adaptation, they can just do that. Bridget Jones's Diary exists. Fire Island exists. Clueless exists. If you have such a fucking problem with the use of language, move it to a time period where you don't have to overcompensate with unfunny modern references.
Now we're worse than exes. We're friends.
There is a running theme of people misunderstanding Jane Austen when they attempt to adapt her work. I felt a similar rage at Sanditon when they decided to add a cliffhanger ending to the first season, something which Jane herself would never ever have done, and something they only got away with because the novel wasn't finished when she died, and they thought that they could just take that source material and bend it every which way until it was no longer identifiable as a Jane Austen novel, but as yet another generic dramatic romance. It isn't that hard to write a good adaptation of something. Or at least it shouldn't be. This movie didn't even clear the lowest bar. Read the novel. Because I'm convinced not a single person associated with this film has done anything beyond scrolling the SparkNotes with one hand while skim-watching Bridgerton with the other. Don't watch this movie. Don't let Netflix think that this falls under the category of so bad it's good and greenlight another 5 terrible Jane Austen adaptations. It's not so bad it's good. It's just bad. There is supposedly a modern adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in the works at Netflix called The Netherfield Girls, and I am half agony, half hope that it will be something that understands the original appeal of that story, rather than just another generic or generically bad interpretation of novels that are anything but. I want to be able to watch these things and feel the need to tell people how ardently I admire and love them, drag my friends who don't care about Regency romance into watching them with me until they're converted too, but that's never gonna happen when they keep making films like this. Anyway, what I'm saying is that somebody should hire me. Hi, this is Editing Talus. 2 months later, don't look at me. I spent so long writing that essay, and then when I was going through and scrubbing through the film again for footage, it just, like, I couldn't. I hated that movie so much, I literally had to put it down. But I'm back at it now, and I was looking for, like, articles to find specific examples of people who say things like, oh, we wouldn't have made it if we didn't update it, because, like, that's dumb. And I found an article, I'm just gonna throw it up on screen. This is what this article says. And it's so infuriating, because, like, why do you think you understand what Jane Austen wants? You don't. Like, that's not who she was. This is... I'm furious.
Whatever your mind is, stop using words imaginatively this instant. I can't bear it.